As long as BART continues to get so much of its revenue from taxpayers and subsidies, they don't need to be responsive to the customers.
The Bay Area Rapid Transit, otherwise known as BART, was once the pride of San Francisco. But according to the recent reports on reliability, customer satisfaction, and safety, BART has been falling behind other metropolitan transit systems.
So they want to dole out overly generous compensation packages, which makes the union members happy and it makes the politicians get votes, but it does absolutely nothing in terms of providing a better service to the customers.
My guest today is Lawrence McQuillan, Senior Fellow at Independent Institute. Today he will explain why BART has fallen behind and how it can improve its service.
So much of their money comes from other places that's where their focus is. It's not on the customer.
I'm Siamak Korami. Welcome to California Insider.
Thank you so much. It's great to be back.
We want to talk to you about BART in San Francisco. You actually have a report out on BART. They want to expand, but you had this report out kind of criticizing how they're operating. Can you tell us more about what they're doing, what the expansion is, and then let us know about your report?
Right. So BART opened in September of 1972. So this year is its 50th anniversary. So we thought that would be an appropriate time to do a deep dive on BART performance and just to kind of compare and contrast. When BART opened, I mean, it was worldwide news story. There was coverage all around the world about BART. It was state-of-the-art technology at the time in 1972. Dignitaries, celebrities came out to ride the BART system. Richard Nixon was the president at the time, and he came out to the San Francisco Bay Area to ride it. Muhammad Ali was out to ride BART. So it was a big story at the time because it really was the latest and greatest in urban transportation. But since then, as we show in the report, there's been a steady decline in performance. We look at 5 different metrics, performance indicators, and using BART's own data, it shows that performance has been sliding across these 5 areas, which we can talk about more in depth. But overall, the system is not giving the Bay Area residents what they were promised, which is reliable, safe, clean transportation. And I think after 50 years, it's time to make significant changes.
Can you tell us where you have found these issues where the system is not performing well?
Right. So one of the main areas is reliability, on-time performance. And just, again, using their own data and looking at several years going back, their on-time performance is about a failure rate of about 10 to 15%. So 10 to 15% of the time, you're not going to arrive at your destination on time. And we also looked at, for example, crime. So over a last 4-year period that was looked at, crime on BART doubled. And we're talking about, not just minor things, but major murders, kidnappings, assault, robberies. So, I mean, it's major crime so BART's really become a magnet for criminals over time. We also looked at overall customer satisfaction, which is probably kind of the broadest indicator of how happy customers are. And BART fails with customers about 30% of the time, and they get about a 70% satisfaction rating. And but think about that: 30% of the time they fail to meet the expectations of their own riders and provide a poor passenger experience. And yet BART is happy about that. And we also looked at financial stability and financial responsibility. And across the board, you can conclude BART's a very financially reckless organization. for the next 4 years, they have massive deficits projected of accumulation of $1 billion worth of deficits. And of course, that has to be made up by taxpayers. So they rely on huge bailouts from taxpayers to maintain operations, expand the system, pay, benefits, overly generous, of entry level, for example, an entry level train operator will earn about $95,000 a year, which is a pretty good pay. You don't need anything but a high school diploma, and you don't actually operate the trains because the trains are automated. So they also have overly generous benefits, either no cost or low cost health insurance, dental insurance, vision insurance, healthcare benefits in retirement, a pension plan that's very generous that the workers pay very little into when you compare it to what other public sector employees pay around the country. So they're very willing to enter into these very generous, overly generous compensation packages for their employees because they're basically paying with government taxpayer subsidy money. So they can afford to be reckless with their finances and not provide the best rider experience at the lowest cost for the passengers.
Lawrence, we reached out to BART and they told us that 90% of their trains are getting there on time. As you mentioned, 10 to 15% of the time they don't get there on time. And they said that was good. Is that bad? Is that not a good metrics?
Well, I mean, I think if you're riding BART, you expect it to be on time and you want to get to your destination on time, especially given the fact that most of the riders are commuters who are going to work and they need to arrive on time. But I think the best indicator of how poorly they're doing is to compare it to other systems around the world. And if you look at Hong Kong's metro system, for example, or Tokyo's metro system, they have near perfect 100% reliability. So in that comparison, apples to apples, I think BART really looks poor and deficient in providing poor service to its customers.
Now about crime, how do they stand compared to other systems? Because a lot of other systems have crime as well.
Right. Well, we looked into that. It's very difficult to compare apples to apples. So because different systems around the world measure it differently. So we weren't able to get a really straight line comparison between systems. But I think if you just compare BART in the past to BART today, just to give you one indication, when BART first opened, there were companies that would actually rent out train cars for parties on BART. I mean, that's how cool and hip and safe it was. Today, I can't imagine any company in the Bay Area wanting to even consider renting out a BART train for a party. I mean, their employees want to avoid BART at all costs. I mean, and then if you look at BART, as I mentioned earlier, over a recent four-year period, crime has more than doubled. So I think even measuring BART against itself, you can't say that BART is getting any safer. In fact, it's getting worse. And most of these crimes are committed by gate jumpers. So they don't pay fare. They just hop over these outdated turnstile type gates that they have at the BART stations. And it's really the gateway crime because they can so easily just hop the gate, get into the system, and they see people as easy victims. Because think about it, once you're in the BART system, you're on their platforms, you're in their trains, you're kind of a captive person for a criminal. There's no easy escape from somebody once you're in their system. So, which makes, I think, even more important that BART pay more attention to reducing crime because it's so easy to victimize people once they enter the system and there's no way out, no easy escape. One incident a few years back that really aggravated, outraged the Bay Area community was that they discovered that the so-called security cameras that they had on their trains were dummy cameras. They were fake cameras. They weren't operating. So they gave people a false sense of security, as well as some very serious crimes occurred right next to these cameras, right under the cameras. And so people figured, well, it's on tape, so they'll be able to find the perpetrator. And that's how the Bay Area community found out, because BART had to admit that these cameras were dummy cameras. 77% of the cameras were either fake or broken at the time this story hit a few years back. So, I mean, that just outraged the public, because, you know, you're paying money to get into the system. So you're figuring that they're doing everything they can to protect the customer, but they're not. So that was really since then, the cameras have been activated. So that's an improvement, but it took serious crimes and missed opportunities to catch the bad guys by not having working cameras on these train cars.
You mentioned the customer satisfaction surveys, and I took a look at them, and they had been dropping steadily, but then they had a gain it was 56% in 2018. I believe it's 70% in 2020, right?
72.
72%. Yeah. So yeah. Why do you think that is? Why do you think people are not happy with this system? And it's kind of a symbolic system for San Francisco, right? You picture San Francisco,
and you picture numbers, and they've been as low as almost 50% in terms of customer satisfaction. And then they jumped up in the most recent survey to 72%. So BART did a press release, and they went on the media saying, you know, isn't this great? Our system is improving so much. But what they failed to say is that the survey was done during the pandemic, when ridership was about 10 to 15% of normal. So it was a huge drop. So the samples were totally different. The sample during the pandemic were of people who were very loyal BART riders. They tended to be older, lower income, and they saw BART as, you know, their lifeline, their only source of reasonably affordable travel in the Bay Area to get to work during the pandemic. But normally you'd have a much greater mix of different types of people. So the two samples weren't comparable at all, but BART made it seem like they were comparable, that they were comparing apples to apples, when in fact they were much different samples, because the ridership had changed so drastically and shifted towards more loyal customers. But the interesting thing is they did another survey in early 2021, last year, and well, I guess the middle of the pandemic. And even with ridership as low as about 10 to 15% of normal, 1/3 of the customers still complained about the cleanliness of the cars. So even with so few passengers, they still couldn't keep the cars clean, which I think is really a testament to how little BART really cares about the overall rider experience on their trains. And when it was easy to do, they still didn't do it.
Now, why do you think this is happening? You mentioned that they may not care about the customer experience. Do you think that they truly not care about the customer service experience, or do you think that there's other reasons why they're not able to meet the demands?
Well, I think it's the overriding conclusion that we had when we looked into all this is that the reason they don't improve the overall customer rider experience is because they don't have to in order to bring in revenue. In a typical year, subsidies, government taxpayer subsidies, are about 40 to 50% of their operating revenue. During COVID, it went up to as high as 80% of their operating revenue comes from subsidies. So when that much of your income comes from non-customer sources, you don't have to give the consideration and the attention to the riders like you would if 100% of your revenues came from customer-based sources. So I think it's the fact that, you know, they focus on where their money is coming from, which is overwhelmingly not the riders. So they want to satisfy the politicians. And what do the politicians want then? And it turns out I mean, they want to satisfy the labor unions because the unions vote for them. So they want to dole out, overly generous compensation packages, as we talked about earlier, and which makes the union members happy, and it makes the politicians get votes, but it does absolutely nothing in terms of providing a better service to the customers. I mean, think about it. If all of these excessive pay and benefit packages resulted in better service, you wouldn't see, the dangerous cars, the unsanitary cars, the unreliable service. You'd actually have the best service possible. So obviously, all of this overcompensation isn't translating into a better overall rider experience. In fact, what we argue in the study is that overcompensation isn't neutral. It actually crowds out money that would have otherwise been spent on improving the overall customer experience. So as long as BART continues to get so much of its revenue from taxpayers and subsidies, they don't need to be responsive to the customers. The money comes from the federal government, the state government, local government, for example, sales taxes, property taxes, bridge tolls. So if you go over the Bay Bridge or the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, you're actually helping to contribute to the BART revenues. So much of their money comes from other places that's where their focus is. It's not on the customer.
Now, you mentioned the financial side of things. In your report, you had mentioned some outrageous expenses where somebody that was cleaning the train was getting paid 120 hours a week, something like that. They've had examples like that. Could you explain that?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned earlier, train operators. So, their starting salary is about $95,000, which is, very good for entry level. But some of them make as much as $250,000 a year when you include overtime and also benefits on top of that. One of the examples we highlighted in the report was a janitor that was received $271,000 in 1 year, and there was footage of him disappearing into a closet for big chunks of the day where he wasn't doing his job. I don't know if he was sleeping or looking on his phone, watching videos. There's no explanation for it. BART never did an audit to try to figure out what was going on, but yeah, imagine a janitor making $270,000 a year. There was about 50 janitors that were making more than $100,000 a year. And the fact is, I think the public would be understanding about it if the stations were clean, the cars were clean, the elevators were clean, the escalators were clean, the bathrooms, but that's not the case. So obviously they're making really, really good salaries and benefits, but they're not providing top-notch service to the customers.
So the money that's spent is not really getting into good service for the customers.
Right. Yeah. And it's time and time again, station agents that are sleeping or they're unhelpful when people have questions about where to go. It's one report after another. I mean, BART has its own police force that their motto is, we put the customer's safety first. And yet crime has doubled in the last 4 years. So again, BART is receiving a whole lot of money, both from the riders and from the taxpayers, but it's not being translated into top-notch service across the board.
So you had some recommendations on fixing these. What is your top solution? How would you guys solve this?
Well, it would take time to right the ship. We're not going to pretend like this would be an overnight fix, but yeah, we recommended a couple things. One is to gradually and eventually get to the point where you eliminate all taxpayer subsidies so that BART has to provide top-notch service to lure riders back to its system. And if it doesn't, it doesn't have the operating money to continue. So, it would force BART to be responsive to the customer rather than the politicians if it was no longer receiving subsidies. And the other major recommendation would be to sell BART to a private for-profit entity, because again, that would encourage innovation, new technology, cost cutting, and innovation, not just in terms of cutting costs, but also improving the technology, upgrading the technology. So for example, you're using the best gates that people can't easily jump over to protect the safety of the customer, that you're also innovating in terms of revenue sources. Why should a subway system just operate subways? Perhaps it would be better if it also got into ride sharing or ferry service. There could be loyalty programs. If you use BART and use their ride share, for example, to get to the BART station, there could be a loyalty program for that. They could expand their sources of revenue. They could have licensing agreements for their stations and for their cars. You could have a Coca-Cola station in downtown San Francisco or whatever. And you could also do a much better job in terms of advertising revenue. So there's lots of different sources of revenue that they could rely on that right now they're not maximizing and they're not even being creative about. So I think, again, being a for-profit entity would allow them to be more responsive and innovative in terms of not only the technology and innovations, but also in terms of revenue sources. If you look at, the for-profit private systems in Tokyo and in Hong Kong, again, they have almost 100% on-time reliability. They're cheaper. We looked into their fares for a comparable route in San Francisco versus in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is much cheaper. So it would actually help low-income people because, again, they make innovations and becoming more efficient through new technology. So it's not the case that it would actually harm low-income people. It would actually help them if BART became for-profit. So there's many benefits. And I think it's also been shown that just in terms of customer satisfaction, again, the numbers aren't comparable, but in terms of just the media's reaction to private for-profit subway systems in Tokyo and Hong Kong, I mean, they say they're like the envy of the world. They're clean and safe. There's less crime. Of course, the protests in Hong Kong, some of them happened in the subway, but that's kind of an outlier situation. But before that, they were incredibly safe and incredibly reliable. So that's another major recommendation, is to eventually sell BART to a private for-profit entity, because it would help overall in terms of rider experience and also, I think, reduce fares long term.
When we talked to BART, they actually told us that if they go the for-profit corporation, they're going to make some people rich in the process. They thought this is a public service and they should not do that. Do you think they can lower the cost of riding and improve the quality if they go? How would they do that, if you can explain that?
Well, a couple ways. And one would be investments in efficiency. So, for example, until recently, BART was still using 1960s and 1970s technology to operate their train system. So as a result, they needed to have fewer trains further spaced apart and could handle fewer passengers. So right there, if you improve the overall software and computer system, you could have more throughput of passengers and reduce the price that way. Another way is that overall efficiency would improve, and that I think if you compare the for-profit private systems overseas to BART, that I think people would value a system. I mean, even if some people got wealthier as a result of providing better service, that I think the passengers would be willing to make that trade-off in terms of having investors become wealthier, but still providing a better, faster, cleaner, safer commute for riders. I don't think riders would really care if somebody's getting wealthier, because what they care about is their overall daily experience on the train. We looked at like studies of other systems that have been privatized. There's not that many around the world that are for private subway systems. So we looked at bus systems that have gone from public ownership to private ownership, and you get about a 30% reduction in fare costs from going private rather than public. And again, that's upgrades in technology, upgrades in software, computer systems. And so, there's a lot of ways to improve. The most obvious, of course, is that if you weren't receiving all of this money from government sources, you wouldn't be paying these outrageous compensation packages. Frankly, most of the money that BART takes in is, going towards overcompensation of labor union employees. And the only reason they can sustain that is because of all of this taxpayer money that's being funneled into it. So the subsidies really prop up the compensation packages to these outrageous levels that you wouldn't be paying a janitor $270,000 a year to sleep in a closet if it was a for-profit company, because you'd have to provide, low cost, high quality service to the customers in order to get the revenue. If you weren't, you couldn't survive. But you can today. You can provide poor service at high cost, and because you're getting all of this subsidy money.
So for people that live in San Francisco, some people that are living in San Francisco, they believe that public transportation is better than traveling with your car. It might hurt the environment. And they might also think that this is part of the city. So this is a public property. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you have to generate huge amounts of electricity to generate the power for BART to operate. And if it's so underutilized, which it currently is, and if you add more mileage to the system, which they're currently proposing, for tens of billions of dollars, that you're going to be running more trains or more miles, more electricity, and it's an underused system. It's not even close to capacity. So, on a net basis, you're probably generating a lot more pollution by continuing to expand BART. The studies that I've seen is that these kind of massive hub and spoke operations where they collect people around the perimeter, and they bring them into the city center, downtown city center for jobs. They only really make sense, and they're only really economically viable and environmentally a net benefit if you have thriving downtown jobs, which there's every indication is that there's not going to be a return to life as we knew it anytime soon, perhaps ever, in San Francisco. I think 20% of all office space is vacant in San Francisco. Only about 25% of all workers go in even one day a week now to their office. Many companies have announced, the biggest companies in the Bay Area have announced a remote, first type approach to work. So and even BART's own projections, if you look at their, mid-case projections and their worst case projections, is that, for example, their worst case scenario is that ridership will never return to where it was. So why are we even talking about a second Transbay tube for more cars if ridership will never even return to where it was before the pandemic? And frankly, San Francisco is the only county in the 9-county Bay Area that, or not the only, but the county in the 9-county Bay Area that suffered the highest percentage loss of population in the most recent tally. So people are leaving San Francisco. About 16, 17,000 people, I think it were, left over the last 12-month period. So it's actually depopulating, and there's less demand for commuter ridership now, and according to BART's own projections, maybe forever. So so it really seems kind of not the best time to want to expand the system and to put more money into massive infrastructure that uses a huge amount of electricity to run. I think you can make a very strong case. In fact, we talk about it in the report that, rideshare, automobiles and buses are still environmentally the best alternative if you're concerned about the environment. It's far better than this huge BART system that's running at 10-20% of capacity. It's crazy, and even the number of cars has increased greatly back to close to where it was before the pandemic. So moving all of this heavy infrastructure around on wheels that's oftentimes almost empty for major parts of the day doesn't seem to me the best environmental approach when ride share has been incredibly popular. People choose to take it. For example, when they allowed ride share to go to the San Francisco International Airport and also to the Oakland Airport, people loved it. People took ride share, and BART revenues fell on both of those lines dramatically when they introduced rideshare to the airports. So when people have an option, they prefer rideshare, and it's actually the most environmentally friendly approach compared to this huge monstrosity of moving all of these heavy train cars on wheels all around the city, or all around the Bay Area, in fact, not just the city.
Tired of scrolling Netflix? Trying to find something that's worth watching? Want to skip the censorship in mainstream media? Well, now you can with Epic TV. New exclusive content every day with over 100 never-before-seen movies, films, and documentaries. Available and streaming now at your fingertips. For a limited time now, you can get 60% off Epic TV by subscribing or upgrading to a yearly plan. Plus, get an additional $10 credit to rent featured movies on Epic Cinema today. Skip mainstream narratives and find quality family entertainment from the comfort of your very own home. Say no to big tech and subscribe to Epic TV.
Lawrence, what can happen if BART continues, if there's no changes to this system?
Well, I think, they stated very well in their most recent financial performance document that they released. And they said, we have to keep finding more and more subsidies. And I think that's what the future is for BART if it continues down this path. Is it just going to have to keep finding more and more taxpayer money to bail it out? And at the same time, it's not meeting its operating revenue, budget. I mentioned earlier, over the next 4 years, it has operating deficits totaling $1 billion. But it also has all of these grand plans to expand. So there's a plan to build a second Transbay tube. It's basically an underwater tunnel that goes between Oakland and San Francisco for more car service, subway service. And also it wants to expand down to San Jose. It has plans to improve the throughput through the current Transbay tube. So, it has these grand plans for massive expansion, but it doesn't have money to do it. So 95% of its current capital budget comes from subsidies. 95%. So, what we're looking at is just funneling more and more taxpayer money into underperforming transit systems that wouldn't have to be underperforming, though. I think if it went through, to use the model that we see in Tokyo and Hong Kong. And at the same time, I don't see service improving if they keep relying on subsidies. So I think crime will increase, especially if they don't upgrade the gates to get into the system. I think the cars will be more unsanitary than they are today as ridership returns. Right now, it's at about 25% of normal, pre-pandemic ridership. But as riders return, it's going to get more filthy and more dirty and more unreliable too, as you have more passengers return. And so I don't see it as improving at all unless there's these major structural institutional reforms that we are proposing. If some of them aren't adopted, the major reforms, I don't think the system's going to improve. In fact, I think it's probably going to get worse.
Now, do you have any other thoughts for our audience?
Well, another one of our recommendations, and I think this is a very important one, and again, everything I'm saying about BART also applies to the transit systems in Los Angeles, in San Diego. They're proposing, this, I think it's $160 billion, 200-mile expansion in San Diego of their transit system, including, the rail system. So everything I'm saying about BART also applies throughout the country. And it's because, they keep using the subsidy money from the government to expand. They keep adding more miles of dirty, dangerous, underutilized services that taxpayers end up funneling huge amounts of subsidy money into, billions and billions of dollars a year. And they're not getting, their money's worth from it. So it's not just a Bay Area problem. It really is a problem throughout California, throughout the country. We're seeing the double-digit percentage reductions in ridership. This is before the pandemic in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in Miami, San Francisco, about a 3 to 5% reduction drop off in riders every year since 2016 up into the pandemic, at which time, it fell off a cliff at that point. But you're seeing a steady drop of ridership, not only in Bay Area, but all around the country in terms of these transit systems, because they are dangerous, dirty, unreliable. People don't want to use them. If they can find alternatives, they'll take them willingly. And yet we keep funneling all of this money into these urban parasites that just keep taking in more and more subsidy money and providing worse and worse service over time.
Is there anything that you recommend the San Francisco residents to do about BART, or is there any way they can let their concerns known to the BART?
That's a great question. I think, citizens, especially riders, need to constantly tell BART that they're not living up to their mission. They're unsatisfied, especially the BART board. Attend the BART board meetings and make it clear that this is unacceptable. After 50 years, you should be able to get it right. And also, I would also encourage greater use of substitutions and competition. So that's another one of our recommendations, is vigorous competition from other sources of mobility. And the Bay Area is very unique because it has this huge, large body of water right in the middle of it. San Francisco Bay to the south, San Pablo Bay to the north. So at one point in the 1930s, San Francisco had a very vigorous, competitive ferry service that was was eliminated by 1958 by various state laws. But at one time, 50 to 60 million people every year cross the San Francisco Bay by ferry boat to get to work and get back home. 250,000 people every day pass through the San Francisco ferry building. So, it was a very vigorous, robust industry that state legislators purposefully put out of business by various state laws that ran them out of business. And it's right now, I mean, it's coming back, but it's a shadow of its future self. So, I mean, you can have water taxis, water buses, water ferries. You could have a lot more competition in terms of rideshare. Right now, you know, California's passed laws to try to harm rideshare rather than help rideshare. Recently with AB 5, the independent contractor law. So, and also you could have a lot more, you know, express lanes on freeways for either rideshare or carpool or that sort of thing. So there's all sorts, and then there's micro mobility, bikes and e-scooters, and there's e-bike rentals in downtown San Francisco, for example, and e-scooter rentals in the city. So there's also micro mobility for people who want to, you know, live close to where they work. But I think all of these other forms of competition would be good for BART because it would actually force BART to up its game and improve its service. Otherwise, it would suffer even more losses. But I'm, you know, I'm hopeful that BART can, you know, can learn, and that, you know, over time, subsidies would fall and it would rely more and more on customer-based revenue and really, hopefully over time, improve its performance. It probably would take private ownership to really see a drastic change. But I think if you could just gradually over time cut the subsidies and had BART, you know, rely more on customer satisfaction and customer-based revenue, it'd be a huge improvement for the riders.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching. Click the video below to watch more. If you enjoy our content, consider subscribing to our channel. We cover the most critical issues California is facing. We'll see you in the next video.